We will then on the program, I mean, I guess most of you have seen the program. We will have 3 presentations, about 3-4 minutes with film clips each. And every one of those, the filmmakers will then have a short introduction about their approach, about their works, and it's a specific work, I guess. And afterwards, Christina Clark-Kazak from Ottawa University will discuss their works, so she will kind of respond on the works from a methodological point of view. And then we will open the discussion. First, among the panelists, we'll have a little discussion. I will try to share the discussion. And then later we will open for everybody else, for the other participants, those ones who have been invited here to take part in the discussions and, you know, comment and ask and so on. And we kindly, of course, we ask the general audience to stay muted and use only the chat function if they want to participate. And Markus and Erin will and me we will take care to you know, to follow the chat function to make sure if anybody has questions that we can kind of take it that way. So now I will briefly introduce all 3 speakers just now in the beginning, so we don't have to make breaks on the way. And I will do it quite briefly. There are more information on the homepage on every one of the speakers if you're interested, and also on the internet today you'll find nearly everybody on everybody, I guess, more or less. Well, I start in the I take the order of appearance. I mean, the one who's starting first will be Robert Knight. So I'll just briefly say some words on Robert. Robert is currently an associate professor of art at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. He received what's it called? A master in photography of the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and a BA, a bachelor in architecture and economics from Yale University. And he's very much involved, of course, in doing his own artworks and exploring the relationship between, you know, culture, architectural spaces, and using photography, video, audio, installations, and so on. About the architectural spaces, of course, interesting that Hans Christian is also very much engaged with architecture and urban planning. So I guess it's also interesting to have some overlaps there. Robert's installation has been exhibited in a lot of galleries, museums. He had a couple of solo exhibitions. I will not mention them all now here. I think that's too much, but show them up. It's I'm quite impressed by the CV from Robert. You know, just to mention some places: Stanford Museum of Art in Massachusetts. I think it's late in the evening. He's in Jan Beckman Gallery in New York, and you know, some other places, Museum of Fine Art in Boston, and so on. And he has also been having exhibitions in France, in Nantes, Le Mans, Arles, and so on. So there's really a long list of artwork. And then I come just briefly to the second speaker, Hans Christian Post. I mean, I know I've been knowing Hans Christian for quite some time, so I'll try to keep it a bit short as well. He holds a master degree and a PhD from modern culture from the Department of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen, where I also had my PhD from. So we come from the same place, so to speak. And he has been working quite extensively on city planning, urban planning, building preservation, at least in the last film, and memory and history politics. He has been engaged in documentary filmmaking for many years, since 2000. He has also partly been working in theater field. And then since 2014, he really started to work independently as filmmaker and producer. And I just very briefly mentioned one or two of the films. The Last Exit, Alexanderplatz film from 2015, dealing with the architectural struggle in East Berlin after the war in the 90s, after the wall came down, and then followed by Whose City. The film We Are Here from 2019, he will say a little bit more about. That's the one we're going to discuss. His last film is an award-winning Where To With History, dealing with the reconstruction in Dresden and the reemergence, what could even say, the search of right-wing populist extremists, however you call it, in Dresden. And the last film, actually I don't remember the name of the festival. It has been winning, but Hans Christian, you just mention if you want to a little bit more on that. At the moment, he's teaching courses at the Department of the Study of Culture at University of Southern Denmark, where I'm employed as well. So we are colleagues there. And he's also doing guest lectures in different other film and architecture schools in Rotterdam, Delft, and Copenhagen, and so on. And then the last speaker will be Max Czollek. Max Czollek is a German lyric poet, writer, and stage performer. In 2009, he was a founding member of the G13 Authors Collective. It means he's also working in collective work. And has been a co-writer for the Babel Speech project since 2013, which is kind of an international, cross-national network among young German-speaking poets, which is a great homepage as well. His own publications include essays, poetry collections, very much doing also poetry. His books Gegenwartsbewältigung and Desintegration, Desintegriert euch, has been quite popular. I mean, in the sense that they kind of really has been seen in the public discussion in Germany. I will not say very much about it now, but I personally think it's interesting work, so I'm very happy to see Max here. What maybe could be interesting for the film today, for the discussions today, that he in 2016 co-organized the event Desintegration Congress for Contemporary Jewish Positions at the Maxim Gorki Theatre, I think together with Sascha Marianne Salzmann, if I remember right, and then was also involved in the Radical Jewish Cultural Days at the Maxim Gorki Theatre and so on. So he's really involved in some of the curating work and doing interesting work there. And he has been invited to various festivals, Zeitkunst Festival, Lyric Festival Basel, Poesy Festival Berlin, and so on. So I'm very happy to have Max here as well. And then I will just briefly, just to finish this kind of introduction talk, and I guess you all want to start discussing the real thing. But is just to very briefly to introduce Christina. Christina Clark-Kazak is Associate Professor, School of Public International Affairs, President of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, and immediate past editor-in-chief of Refuge, Canadian Journal on Refugees. She has previously worked for the New York University, St. Paul University. She has been doing work for the Canadian government and the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. So really impressive CV as well. I learned that Christina also served as the president of the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. Has been the director of York's University Center for Refugee Studies, among other things. She has, her work has been published in various books and articles on international migration and development. And of course, she received a lot of funding from British government and non-governmental organizations. So I'm really happy that Christina is here as well to comment on the work from the artist being here, researchers, artist. So I tried to make it a bit brief. I hope it worked out a little bit, even though being a bit tired here, but I think it will be great. I will wake up in a moment when everything starts. So I'm looking forward to get started. I think we just give the room to Robert to start out with his introduction with the film, some minutes, and then saying some words on it. I guess I'm looking very much forward to to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Moritz, and thank you, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and look at the first few minutes of the film that I selected. Correct? Is that the next step, Markus?
Yes, that's correct. I'm going to share it.
Great. Thank you.
I don't think our Lord would be happy with the language we are hearing these days, the threats people are facing. Only the other day in Kentish Town, my counterpart, the parish priest there, Father Xavier, tells me that a well-known local citizen, friendly with everyone who came in the health food shop where he worked, where he'd been working for 14 years, who had lived in this country making no trouble for nearly 3 decades. That is 30 years after he fled the violence and civil unrest and prejudice in the former Yugoslavia. This person was taken away in the early hours, told he was going to be sent back home. Home! Somewhere that does not exist any longer. His country has disappeared from the map. Where's he to go? This is how the Romans behaved to the Christians at first. This is how Saul conducted himself before the road to Damascus, and the great light blasted some sense into him, and he became Paul. This is like, well, I shan't say, but what echoes do you catch in the sentence that the Prime Minister spoke a few years ago when she was Home Secretary? She said then to the Daily Telegraph, not your paper, the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigration. What does that mean? It means sweeping up all kinds of people, branding them with the same stigma, regardless of their contribution, their humanity.
Temporary indefinite detention. How do you measure time that's both temporary and indefinite? That's a question for Stephen Hawking, not an answer to the rules of human law supposed to protect and help people who need refuge, care, and hope. Indefinitely temporary. Temporarily indefinite. Holding people prisoners of language. Prisoners have proper sentences that can be counted down, marking the days off on a 5-bar gate that opens when the time is done. But our detainees face unlimited days that can only be counted upwards without the end in sight.
Thanks, Markus. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and share a little presentation I have here to talk more about my background and my work. So good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Knight, the director of Strangers in a Strange Land, and I teach at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. And as we're all thinking about place and talking about migration, I want to recognize and thank the ancestral Oneida Nation on which Hamilton College sits in upstate New York. And I also want to thank Erin and Markus for including me today in today's event. I'm really excited to be here and to learn from everyone today and talk about my project. So I want to start off with a little bit of background on my practice. I was trained as a photographer, but I began supplementing my work with video early on in my practice. And I use photography, video, sound, and installation to address social issues connected to the communities around me, but rooted in my own personal experience. And I've been particularly interested in how aspects of individual and community identity change over time in the relationship between architectural space and identity, and in using photography and video to explore those changes and issues. I've included these 2 quotes and want to ask us to consider, how do we use Grierson's hammer to raise the sorts of questions in our work that Sontag provokes while creating a respectful space for our subjects. This is an image from an early photography project called Dwelling. And one of the challenges that I've struggled with in my work is the issue of representation. How does one represent people and complex social issues without objectification. And studying postmodern theorists such as Martha Rossler and David Levi-Strauss only cemented the inadequacy of traditional forms of documentary work. And I've spent the last 15 years exploring alternative approaches. In this project, Dwelling, I photographed domestic still lives as a type of portrait in order to better understand our relationship to material objects and their influence on ourselves and our children. And what I was interested in this project was a kind of dual portrait that this image contains of both a parent and a child, with the child's interest in playing cowboys and Indians sort of pitted against the expectations of success and achievement suggested by the father's briefcase as a plaything. This is Dorothea Lange's famous image, Migrant Mother, which has this sort of Madonna and child-esque sympathy laid over the hardship of the Depression era. Martha Rossler, in her text In, Around, and Afterthoughts on Documentary Photography, argued that one of the failures of traditional documentary work, such as that by Lange, was that it served to objectify her subjects, and there was, quote, quote, no follow-up of the subjects over time. Bill Ganzel, who was a photo historian and photographer, addressed Rossler's challenge directly by rephotographing a number of iconic subjects by Depression-era photographers, including the image of Migrant Mother by Lange. And here we see Florence Owens Thompson, yes, she has a real name, with her daughters, photographed in California in the 1970s. So confronting this issue of objectification in documentary photography and filmmaking is, I think, central to some of the aims of collaborative storytelling, to effectively addressing social issues without aestheticization.
Robert, sorry for interrupting.
Yes.
I cannot see any images. You're referring to images. Were you trying to share your screen? Sorry, I should.
Yes,
I can see the screen, or I could.
Okay.
You could.
Oh, it's on my side. Sorry. So.
I'll go back to the PowerPoint and let's see if maybe there's something. You all see the screen right now?
It was fine before.
Yes.
I can see.
Yeah, I can see it.
I can see it, Rob.
All right, great.
Yeah, sorry. Might have been just on my side. I apologize.
No, that's good to know, Markus, because if you're not seeing it, then maybe others aren't either, but it sounds like most people are, so thank you. So I wanted to continue with this. One approach to Rossler's issue of a lack of follow-up in documentary work, I long appreciated Michael Apted's 7 Up series, in which he followed 14 British youth, filming them every 7 years, which I'm sure many of us or most of us are familiar with. When I arrived at Hamilton College in 2011, I launched my own sort of mini longitudinal portrait project called the Class of 2015, in which I followed 29 Hamilton College students during their time in college, making portraits each year, but also including text and video interviews to give each subject their own agency in the process. This is a screenshot from the website, and you can kind of hear interviews and also read text that parallels and pairs with the photographs. I also explored issues of documentary practice and collaborative storytelling through exhibition curation. So in 2014, I curated an exhibition of contemporary photographic portraiture that brought together conceptual artists whose practices addressed underlying socio-political issues. For example, Sharon Lockhart, Alex Soth, and Alfredo Yar, as well as photojournalists and social documentarians who utilized conceptual strategies to subjectively shape the portraits that they created, such as artists Magali Corouge, Krista Bode, and Laurel El Tantawi. And the convergence of these approaches yielded work that kind of balanced aesthetic and political goals to frame social issues in a contemporary way. And I want to get into the Strangers in a Strange Land project. In 2018, I met David Hurd and Anna Pincus, 2 of the organizers of Refugee Tales. Refugee Tales is a UK nonprofit which works to raise awareness about indefinite detention of asylum seekers in the UK through collaboration between former detainees and writers. The UK is the only country in Western Europe that allows indefinite detention of refugees. Anna is also the director of the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group, which provides direct support for asylum seekers while they are in detention. While the majority of asylum seekers are released within 28 days, the longest documented case of detention in the UK was nearly 9 years. And since 2015, Refugee Tales has conducted an annual 5-day walk in the southeast of England, staying each night in the basements of various town churches and community halls, retelling refugee stories and spreading the message of the group as they travel. In the summer of 2019, I was able to travel to the UK for 2 weeks with a student and begin work on the Strangers in a Strange Land project that I hope will raise awareness about refugee tales and the issues of UK asylum detention policies. I'd planned to return in summer 2020 with 2 more students to continue filming, but that work has been delayed due to COVID, and I'm probably not going to be able to go back this summer, unfortunately, either, because they're not really doing the walk this year either. And I want to note this film is a work in progress, and the selections you've watched are not the finished piece. I want to talk a little bit about the conceptual structure of the film. It's centered around the notion of freedom of movement, something that most people in developed countries take for granted. The UK has an extensive network of public rights of way, or footpaths, as they call them, comprising 140,000 miles of public walkways that crisscross cities and connect towns and villages throughout the country. Refugee Tales takes advantage of these walkways to structure their annual walks, enabling a large group of people to travel easily by foot from the town to town without traveling by road. But this type of movement that most Britons and Westerners take for granted is precisely the type of movement that asylum seekers in the UK are restricted from, due to detention, of course, but also simply due to economic precariousness and the logistical challenges associated with frequent Home Office reporting requirements. A secondary focus of the film is the visual juxtaposition of sanctuary spaces in contrast to spaces of detention. Self-declared sanctuary spaces, often housed in community centers and churches, make a public commitment to welcome refugees, to provide them with material support in the form of food and shelter, and create cultural change by encouraging local people and refugees to form personal relationships. Many of these spaces are also used to house the Refugee Tales group during its annual walks. These sites of refuge and sites of oppression run parallel to each other in the film in separate channels, and are overlaid with audio excerpts from the various stories contained in the Refugee Tales books. And the film is divided into sections based on the title of the stories that are included from the books. And the clip we just saw was from a chapter called The Mother. And I want to end here revisiting the question of documentary. In 2001, Martha Rossler stated that as the division widens between rich and poor in the United States and elsewhere, and as art practices are institutionalized and academicized, there is less and less serious analysis of the lives of those on the wrong side of that great divide. Why continue to defend documentary, she asked? The short answer is because we need it. Yes, we do, but we need to do it with profound respect for our subjects, an understanding of the power dynamic inherent in our role as makers, and through collaboration rather than objectification. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Great presentation. I think as we said before, there will be no discussion now, but we jump directly to the next speaker, and then we will discuss later on. Hans Christian, would you like to share some images and maybe say a little bit about the film?
Yes, I will. I think, Markus, you have a clip to show first.
I will.
I Jeg hører stemmer skrev jeg om det her med at vokse op med 2 forskellige kulturer, ikke? Og vokse op med en far, der er egyptisk, og mor, der er dansk. Og mere end det, så også det her med, at 2 lejre, der på en eller anden måde insisterer på, at du skal vælge, du skal være det ene eller det andet, ikke? Hvad hedder det? Og så mit forsøg på sådan at sige, nej, jeg vil gerne bare have lov til at være mig selv, og ikke skulle være defineret af hverken det ene eller det andet, og tage, hvad jeg har lyst til for det her, og tage, hvad jeg har lyst til for det her, ikke? Hvad hedder det? Og hvor svært det kan være, eller besværligt det kan være, når der bliver trukket sådan nogle helt skarpe fronter op. Det blev sådan røgmert-domineret, og det var virkelig velbesøgt. Der var rigtig mange mennesker, der kom og sagde, at de blev rørt af den, eller blev påvirket af den. Så tabte vi til Sound of Music, som jo er en meget banebrydende, helt nyskabende forestilling fra, hvad ved jeg, 50'erne eller sådan noget, ikke? Og som en, der havde vundet en røgmert for årets forestilling, med præcis den samme forestilling 14 år før. Så så det er jeg ikke bitter over, det skal I ikke tro. Allah, 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 og det var Danmark, og det var Danmark, Allah, 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 Allah. Der var et yndigt land, det bliver sådan et, det bliver en eller anden form for fortsættelse af at jeg hører stemmer, ikke? Det handler om angst og det her med at definere sig selv, angst for fremtiden, ikke? Både fra, hvad skal man sige, hvis man er brun, men også hvis man er hvid, og man måske er bange. Altså jeg tænker, hvad er det, der får folk til at handle, som de gør? Der er mange mennesker, der er bange for at miste sig selv i det her globale, du ved, vanvid og usikkerhed, hvad ved jeg, og sådan. Nå, men så skal vi have noget fast at holde fast i, ligesom en fast grund, hvor vi klart definerer, sådan, vi er danskere, vi er det her, og vi er i hvert fald ikke det her, og sådan noget.
Thank you, Markus. And thank you for having me today. It's very interesting to be with you today because I'm still very, very curious about my own film, and maybe you can tell me a little bit about my film today, so I can get a better grasp of what I actually produced. The film is called We Are Here, and the title both hints at the three protagonists of the film, these three young theater directors and actors who form the main strain of the film. It's sort of hinting at these three protagonists saying, we are here also to stay, and we are here also to change things through our artistic work. And it's also hinting, of course, at Denmark, the state of Denmark, Denmark being today a post-migrant society, a society that has been changed by migration. So the title has this double meaning. I started work on the film in late 2016, and then did the filming in 2017 and 2018, and made a rough cut of the film that was shown at a conference in late 2018, and finally the film premiered at the theater festival Copenhagen Stage in May 2019. And when I started work on the film, I had actually just produced one film before that, so I was still quite new in the field of documentary making, and I think also the film somehow testifies to that. I was still not so sure on how to proceed. I didn't have so much experience to build on at that time. The research project that I was involved in is the one that Moritz referred to. That was a research project about post-migration and how this notion, how this term could be applied in the human sciences. And I was involved in late 2016, and at that point, the research project had already run for 1 year. So I was sort of 1 year late, and I didn't know anything about the field. I didn't know anything about post-migration. I didn't know the term. I was very much a guest in the field, and the members had already begun their work on the monography they were going to write, and they also had a very clear structure and recipe for the monography. And I was entering the group to be part of the group, also to do work on the monography to a certain extent, but above all to make the film on the basis of the film that I had already made on the Alexanderplatz in Berlin. And since the project had already been running for a year, we decided that the film should become a work in its own right and should be made independently of the monography. There were, of course, many possible ways of proceeding with the film. As I mentioned, I didn't know anything about post-migration. I didn't know anything about the concept. It was nothing I had ever given any thought. Also, the questions about representation and who gets to represent and how do we represent was not something I had thought about. And also now currently with the new films I'm producing, it's not something I really think very much about. But of course, we did do some thinking about this as I was making the film. I had a couple of talks with Moritz in late 2016 about how we could maybe produce the film. And we decided that we were going to focus on young artists who were in the process of defining their own careers and their own positions, who were just about to start embarking on their careers. And we also decided that we wanted to focus on the theater, as the notion of post-migration comes from the theater originally. We also decided that we wanted to focus on Denmark and to some extent on Germany. We also wanted the film to have a relatively broad appeal, so we didn't want it to be all that experimental. And we wanted to include some of the researchers from our own research project, as it was also going to be a presentation of the research we were doing. And we wanted to include the voices of some of the founding mothers of the term post-migration in the arts and in academia. And then I wanted also to include some of the often harsh public and political voices that you find in Denmark, to somehow show what the protagonists were up against and are still up against. And of course, we also wanted the film to somehow introduce its audience to the notion or the concept of post-migration, a notion that is still often vague and hard to grasp, and a notion that I'm also still somehow overwhelmed by. So you can say the film holds many layers and has many chapters that viewers have to keep track of. And wrapping it all up wasn't so easy. And I still find that the film is very layered, maybe too layered for my own taste, and also holds too much text. So I also, 2 years ago, I decided to make a second, less layered version for a broader Danish audience. And so I took out some text and I took out the entire German chapter and made it a full Danish film in a way. Just let me know when my time is up. So one of the challenges.
1 minute. Maybe 1 minute. 1 minute,
yeah. Okay, I have some more points, but I guess this can come later. I think one of the challenges I experienced, which was quite interesting, was that in this film, which was about post-migrant society, post-migrant Denmark, I somehow needed to depict diversity as this is a sign of a post-migrant society, and that's not so easy to find in a Danish context, because Denmark is a very white country in many ways, at least visually, and the same goes for Copenhagen. So I had to go and look for it. I had to look for the diversity. I had to seek it out, and I had to film it. And that was, and you also see it in this short clip I just showed you, where you have the different layers, the different images that are blend into each other of scenery in Copenhagen, of people in Copenhagen. That's of course a depiction of a post-migrant state. It's a depiction of what one of the protagonists is saying, that we live in these crazy, insecure global times where everything is floating. That was a depiction of that, but it's also a depiction of, you can say, a post-migrant state. And to depict that, I had to look for the diversity, I had to seek it out, and I had to film it. And that felt very uncomfortable in the cityscape, to go out and looking for these people, looking for these shops, looking for these signs. It felt like I was marking it out. And I think also many of the people that were aware of me filming felt like that as well. They felt also they were being marked, and I was often stopped, and they asked me, "What are you trying to film here? Why are you here at all? Why are you here at Nørrebro filming these kind of things?" So I think my time is up. Yes. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans Christian. And we will discuss afterwards, I guess, a little bit about it all. Now, our last speaker for the presentations will be Max Czollek. Max, will you take over, maybe together with Markus, I guess?
Oh, I'd love to. Yes, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the 2 presentations before. It's gonna be a great array of things we can talk about. I would like to present a few of the video works we've been doing in Maxim Gorki Theatre. I'm probably right in saying the central theatre for post-migrant theatre in Germany of the last decade. So that is really very closely connecting to what we've just heard. We produced this video, or the snippet of the video you're about to see is the longer video of 55 minutes, called The Best Supper, das beste Abendmahl, last year for the days of the Jewish-Muslim hegemony, Tage der jüdisch-muslimischen Leitkultur. Markus, would you just show the few minutes we selected?
I will.
Thank you.
Ja, unser Nightwolf.
Ja, Salam, Shalom, meine lieben Mitstreiter, Mitdenker, Mitlenker auf diesem untergehenden Schiff in Seelennot namens Deutschland. Ich glaube, meine lieben Freundinnen und Freunde, es geht um nichts Geringeres als darum. Entweder wir machen uns bereit dafür, das jüdisch-muslimische Haus zu bauen, oder aber wir werden im Land der Reichstagsstürmer untergehen. Das Land der Faschisten, wir sind klug und gebildet genug, das zu sehen ist ein Land, in das wir nicht gehören. Nicht, weil Sie das nicht wollen, sondern weil wir es nicht wollen. Wir wollen es nicht, weil wir das nicht für nötig befinden, so zu leben, ohne diese ungebremste und ungeheure Lust auf Frieden, Freundschaft und Breitbandinternet. Und ja, wir sind nicht nur gegen Windpocken geimpft, sondern auch gegen Lieblosigkeit. Wir sind die sich ihr Entsetzen über das Sterben im Mittelmeer noch bewahrt haben, die sich nicht gegeneinander ausspielen lassen, sich nicht zur Verhandlungsmasse gegen eine humane Flüchtlingspolitik degradieren lassen, die sich jedem Argument verweigern, das mit die Muslime oder die Juden beginnt. Von mir aus können wir, auch wenn wir es nicht wirklich sind, die Muslime und die Juden sein. Ich bin vermutlich diejenige unter uns, auf die diese Begriffe am wenigsten zutreffen. Aber wenn das jüdisch-muslimische Haus steht, werde ich die Concierge sein und wöchentlich freiwillig die Treppen fegen. Ich fühle mich keiner deutschen Gesellschaft zugehörig, die noch nach millionenfachen Mord und Mitläufertum, einem sagenhaften und nachhaltigen Eifer für Auslöschungsfantasien immer noch zu begeistern ist, weil unfähig, ihre Stammbaumobsessionen zu reflektieren und zu therapieren. In so eine Gesellschaft gehöre ich nicht. Ich gehöre an diese Tafel. Eine Tafel, an der wir sehr genau wissen, dass es noch 1, 2 oder 3 Generationen vorher nicht möglich gewesen wäre, so beieinander zu sitzen. Denn die Gesellschaften, aus der wir direkt oder indirekt kommen, waren oder sind einander noch Feinde. Und vielleicht haben wir das deshalb so satt. Das Vokabular der alten Ressentiments, Grenzen, Gräben, Feindschaften, Vertreibungen und Kriege. Ich glaube an keine 2, 3 oder 4 Staatenlösungen. Ich glaube an Versöhnung und ich glaube an Vertrauen. Eine Gesellschaft, die ihren Mitbürgern permanent misstraut, die im Nachbarn immer eine Bedrohung sieht, stößt mich zutiefst ab. Mein Nervenkostüm ist zu schwach und mein Selbstwertgefühl zu stark. Mein Verständnis von Wahrheit und Schönheit zu groß und mein Hassorgan zu mickrig und klein, um auf der Grundlage von Menschenekel nach Gutsherrenart mein Weltbild zu erschaffen. Eine Gesellschaft, deren Vorstellung davon getrieben ist, eine Leitkultur vorzugeben, die in Wirklichkeit nur eine Immunisierung gegen das Konzept von Vielstimmigkeit ist eine untergehende Gesellschaft. Ich aber will leben. Mit euch. Meine lieben bürgerlichen Clanmitglieder mit ungeklärtem Aufenthaltsstatus, ihr wunderbaren bundesrepublikanischen Garanten des ungeordneten Zuzugs, ihr Terroristen meines Herzens und Nobelpreisträger für Freundschaft, ich will mit euch leben. Ich habe diese vor Missgunst, Neid und Niedertracht brodelnde Korregataps-Gesellschaft so satt und ich befürchte, dass dieses Deutschland, so wie es ausschaut, seine einmalige Chance auch auf dem zweiten Bildungsweg vermasseln wird. Es ist ein Deutschland, das verzweifelt an den Enden seiner Gesellschaft nach seiner Mitte sucht und sich immer dort verortet, wo wir nicht sind. Obwohl alles, wirklich alles, was sie essen, was sie besitzen und woran sie glauben, aus unseren Ländern stammt, von uns kommt, so suchen sie ihre Wurzeln doch immer da, wo wir nicht sind. Aber wir sind ihre Wurzeln. Sogar ihr Jesus, würde er heute noch leben, hätte keine Outdoor-Klamotten an und Deutschlandhütchen auf, sondern er würde aussehen wie wir. Er spräche unsere Sprache, die Sprache unserer Ahnen und nicht ihrer. Meine Familie stammt aus einem Dorf, in dem heute noch Aramäisch gesprochen wird.
Thank you. Well, as I said, this is 55 minutes. The person you just heard, her name is Meli Kiak. She is, I would say, one of the most important writers of the post-migrant intellectual tide, if you want so, that has been surging in the last years. I can spare myself a few words on the post-migrant thing because Hans just talked about it, which is great. And I'm happy to hear that this has also been going on in Denmark. I wasn't really aware of that, so that'd be one thing I'd love to talk about. Maybe on the video part of those works, because it's about video and movies today. I would say that like ever since we've started doing work in theater in 2016 with the Integration Congress, then with the Radical Jewish Culture Days, and then with the Days of the Jewish Muslim Hegemony, we have always used video, but not so much as a means of documentation, but rather as a means of intervention. So for the Radical Jewish Culture Days, for example, we introduced a fake news channel called Jews News Today, because we figured that during that time, fake news was very much in the discussion everybody was talking about. We just had Russia Today launching in Germany, and obviously in the States, there was a huge surge of fake news as well. So we were talking about that a lot, and we felt like fake news wasn't only used to redirect political attention and trying to feed whatever stereotypes people would have, but also conveys a certain idea, a certain notion of utopia or dystopia. So in a way, if you believe that the world is works in a specific way, that for example the foreigners are taking away your jobs, or the foreigners are molesting your women, or whatever, this is the news you want to see. So we felt like, why not telling a few Jewish fake news, a few news we would like to see. So we kind of came up with this fake news channel, which was really very silly and a lot of fun. You'll find those online as well with the channel Jews News Today with subtitles. right next to the Best Supper. So with the Jews News Today fake news trailer, we kind of try to combine the idea of a trailer trying to point to the festival we were organizing with the first artwork. Because what we wanted to do was to destabilize the idea of the theater lobby, where you enter and know this is not yet theater, and then you enter the theater space, and then you know this is where the play starts. And also it's not you who's playing, it's the people on stage. So we kind of try to destabilize this to kind of start playing with this idea of where's the theater actually taking place. And this is connecting to a central concept we've been working with for the last years, which is called the theater of memory. The theater of memory is a concept introduced by a Canadian scholar. His name is Michael Bodeman. He's now living in Berlin. I think before he was teaching in Toronto. And he introduced this idea of the theater of memory in 1996, trying to describe the symbolic role, the ideological work is the term he's using, the Jewish subject plays in a German reinvention of itself as the good and better Germany. And what you can see is that the Jewish subject has become more and more central in this reenactment, continuous reenactment of German improvement, self-improvement. So you have those annual calendars of memory days, and the Jews always have to kind of appear and say, yes, it has been horrible, and yes, we're happy to live here now, and yes, much better now, we feel safe. You always have to say that, and then the German side kind of can continue reinventing himself, herself, and kind of stabilize this notion. And that is not an uncommon concept. I've found a similar concept with Gloria Wecker's White Innocence, a book that was written in the Netherlands a few years ago. It's basically taking the same idea of the theater of memory and then what I wrote in De-Integrate Yourselves, but puts that on a post-colonial Dutch society. So really, if you're interested, check out Gloria Wecker, she's amazing. So last words maybe on the Best Supper. Also with the Best Supper, we're aiming to kind of turn things around, but in a different way than in the Jews News Today case I was just describing. Because here, and you saw that you had the Döner, which is like the Dönerspieß, is like the meat. It's a very famous dish in Germany, which is, it developed in Berlin actually, but it's been assigned to the Turkish migration to Germany in the 70s. And we had a golden Döner rotating on the table, and we had kind of golden falafel and golden hummus, and we had kind of Jewish Muslim hegemony. And the thing we kept on repeating was the Jewish Muslim hegemony is better than the idea of German hegemony. It's better, it's more powerful, and it's more real. And we were trying to kind of reclaim this notion of bourgeois artistic spaces and try to turn this around into this kind of hybrid Jewish Muslim post-migrant mashup, which was more fun, more emotional, more intense than anything people would usually get going to a German theater. I know this is all full of pretension, and I know this is all like, this is the whole point of it, right? We are claiming something which kind of is a bit silly, and it's a bit funny, and it's certainly all over the top. And that's what it's all about. It's like, it's an intervention, not a documentary. And it ultimately aims to something that was just mentioned in the chat. This is what I wanted to say in the end, the decentering of dominant discourses. And it would take more time for me now to explain how all those plays and all those interventions, also the video works, responding to a specific setup of the demand for integration, the demand for a hierarchy of cultures, with the German culture obviously being on top, the dominance of a German perspective and desire that is always more dominant than the desire or the perspective of the Jewish, the migrant, or whatever marginalized society would find. And post-migrant theater and post-migrant thought, I think, really means an intervention into this all too common idea of the universal subject, which turns out to be German, white, male, and all the things you already know. So this is really what we're working on, and a video is a part of that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Max. Thank you very much for the presentation and the coming around the whole thing. Great. Well, according to the program, we have now Christina reacting on your presentations and videos. And then after Christina, we open up a little bit among the panels, and I will try to keep things getting to Christina, if you have some comments.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating today. And thank you especially to Erin, Markus, and Liam for having organized the event. I want to also acknowledge that I am in Ottawa on the unceded territories of the Algonquin people, and I acknowledge their histories and their hospitality in allowing me as a guest on their territories. I also wanted to add that I think that as Canadians, we're often sort of smug about our so-called welcoming to refugees, and we have to acknowledge our ongoing complicity in colonization and the historic injustices against our Indigenous peoples. So I have the unenviable task of trying to be a discussant. I also am not a film critic. I'm not a theater professor. I am a social scientist who has an interest in migration, but also an interest in methodology. So I'm going to do what I do when I teach a course that I know nothing about. I'm going to focus on what I actually do know, which is the methodology of storytelling. And I wanted to start my remarks with 3 themes that I saw throughout the 3 pieces, and then ask one question just as an opening question for each of the different filmmakers or the producers to just open up the discussion. So the 3 themes that I see running across all of the different pieces were themes of history, or her story, or their stories, and linking to the temporality of migration. The second is home, making of home, unmaking of home, remaking of home, imagining of what home is. And thirdly, humanizing, or humanity, and how can storytelling humanize but also dehumanize, especially when those of us who are telling stories don't have direct experience of what we're actually telling. So on the notion of history, I think it's quite interesting that this is framed, and 2 of the pieces explicitly are framed around a post-migration, because that implies that there was a pre or a migration. There's a historical temporality. And this is also really comes forward in the film on the UK, this notion of being indefinitely, temporarily detained. So a notion of, we make time and we decide when time begins and ends. Also in the film on Denmark, the so-called old versus new Denmark, this sort of is a marker of pre and post, and a passage of time, and who gets to decide those histories. And this also comes up in the 3rd film about, again, who has the authority to decide how they're telling and the remaking of the history. The second is on home. If we start with the first film on the UK, I mean, I'm spent a lot of time in the UK. I think it's very interesting that the government department that's responsible for immigration is called, among other things, is called the Home Office. This notion of making and remaking home. Who decides who belongs, whether homemaking is part of the migration process, whether in fact we reimagine home and the spaces with the introduction of new people, or whether they're expected to conform to a certain notion of home. The idea that often the far right tells people to go back home as if there is some place where they belong. And this was also brought up in the first film about the UK, where people are being deported to places that maybe they actually never lived in, especially if they're 2nd or 3rd generation. And finally, the notion of humanity and how we use stories to humanize individual experiences, but also try to tell a collective story of humanity, and how we try to find points of reference that are commonalities, whether that be religious commonalities or cultural commonalities across. So now to get into the individual films, again, I know that I have a limited time and there's a lot of other people who have things to say. So I want to just ask one specific question for each of the films. So the first question to Robert on Strangers in a Strange Land. I was very interested in the way in which the stories were told in different accents and different British accents, and how, as you know, in the UK, accents really place a person and localize a person within even the United Kingdom as a country or a nation, but also that it seemed to me, and again, I might have misunderstood, but it seemed as if British people were retelling the stories of migration. Is that correct? And so yes. I'm kind of wondering how, is that is that a way to amplify the voices and to normalize migration for a primarily UK audience? And at what point could that possibly slip into appropriation, which, those of us who don't have a migration experience are often, we have to be quite careful about not telling other people's stories or not stealing people's stories, if you will.
Right. So I think it's a great question, a great point. And I think the short answer of it is that the structure of the Refugee Tales project has been one where the refugees' stories are retold, and they're retold by different writers in the UK. And actually the voices that we're hearing are of various different writers who are reading those stories back. So there's a distancing, a kind of removal from the direct refugee experience through that kind of re-narration. And I think it's an important question to be thinking about, and I'm not sure of the right answer necessarily, but I guess I think about it as this is meant to be a reflection of the Refugee Tales project, and that this is part of their process. And they've got 4 volumes now of those books. The one I showed was the first volume, and each book contains roughly a dozen or so stories from different refugees. And only in the last book, the most recent book, are some of the refugees actually telling their own story. And so I think there is a shift in how the organization is addressing that, and how also a reflection, I think, of comfort on the part of the refugees of being willing to start to tell their own stories. And I think that was, the precedence for it really was to protect and allow them to do what they felt comfortable with in terms of storytelling. And that was always to have this kind of layer of removal, layer of distance to the author. But that does seem to be changing in the last book. And so I think, and there are some other voices in the film as well beyond, that aren't just strict English accents. So there are a few more diverse voices in that dialogue. And I think that, that could be something that's expanded as well in the final version of the film.
Thank you. I mean, I do think it's fascinating also because there's a whole politics of accents within the UK, as you know. And so I think even the fact that there were different, classes that were sort of represented within the different storytelling was also really interesting. So I'll turn now to a question for Hans Christian on We Are Here. And this is around the representation of race. You've already touched briefly on this in your remarks, but I think it was really interesting how all 3 of the key protagonists kind of turned the social construction of race on its head. So Zaki, for example, becomes white at one point in the film, the sort of like mockery of blackface in a way, and mentions that everyone in charge is white, and she wants to try to change that dynamic. And then Sargu from Iraq also talks about how he didn't cast people on the basis of race. He cast people on the basis of their acting ability. And in some cases that kind of destabilized the notion of race. So I wondered if you could comment a bit more on that.
Yes, and Anne Malser did the same, in fact. And in relation to what you mentioned about home, having a home, creating a home. She's doing this because this is where she comes from. I mean, she grew up in this context where there was a lot of diversity. And when she entered theater school, she realized that this is a very white neighborhood, so to speak. there might be a few actors who are colored, but everyone who gets to decide, everyone who has power in this institution, in this theater school, they are whites. And the same goes for all of the theater landscape in Denmark, in fact. And also when you see what is played, it's all plays by white authors and played also in a very traditional sense. And she wanted to change that because she wanted to establish that what she knew from her background, and in a very successful way, actually, you can say, because it's only been a few years since I made the film, and since then she has become a theater director. She has her own house now, where she gets to do exactly this, where she gets to define what is played, by whom is it written, and also what actors are employed and what roles they get to play. And the same goes for Sagan, who is now also, he also now has his own theater. In fact, the theater located in Nørrebro, a very central theater, a small theater, but an important theater in Copenhagen, where we also had the book presentation and where the film, this film was premiered in 2019. So yeah, that's it's about taking charge of this and being able to define what is played by whom and who gets to play, and that also that the issue of color is not can be destabilized, and that the idea is to let the people who will play the role best play the role, and not let color decide, and not let background decide. For Zaki Youssef, it's still a little. I think he's still struggling a little bit. He's also darker skinned, and he's also the one who takes the struggle. He takes the struggle on television programs. He's the one who's invited when the media wants to set up a confrontation between the Identitäre Bewegung on the one side, and then Zaki Youssef, who is in fact who was born in Denmark, who has a Danish mother, who has always been a Danish citizen, but still has to struggle with this feeling of Danishness, because he's very dark and is for this reason seen as someone who doesn't belong. And still, I mean, he made this play where he thematizes it, but whenever he gets to play a role in a bigger film, which is what he actually wants to do, he gets to play the migrant. He gets to play the terrorist. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So my last question is for Max. And I really enjoyed the way that you set up the piece where people were giving speeches. And I think that the whole notion of hegemony and discourse really, was shown by people performing in particular ways and choosing how they perform. So one of the women, for example, decided she wasn't going to stand up because she felt that that was a sort of masculine thing, and she didn't want to sort of reinforce that notion. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about storytelling as performance and the role of discourse, but also who gets the platform and who gets to choose to speak when.
Do you mean in the specific video or in general?
I mean, in the video, but also, I mean, obviously you're trying to make a commentary on something that's bigger. So, I mean, you could address both.
Okay, thank you. Well, in this video, I must say, we were recording. It's a bit of it grew a bit out of the necessities of the current situation. So what we wanted to do actually was a live performance of something that has a history in Germany called Roundtable, Runder Tisch, which was set up after 1890 to kind of discuss about how the unification of the two Germanys would come about. So we felt like maybe we reenact a round table, and then have like people sitting in the middle, and then the audience sitting around, and then the audience being able to tap people out. and be able to participate. But that obviously wasn't possible. So we decided to change the whole concept and try to do something a bit more classical towards appropriating the bourgeois space with all the gold and all that, and try to really tell a counter narrative as if it'd be true. So we didn't try, like, I think the whole point, the whole like point joke about it is to not refute stuff that has been going on, but rather to already act like the counter narrative is already dominant. That was something we did with the integration as well. We said everybody's invited, even Germans. So that is already a performative element of what we're doing. And I guess by inviting the people we invited, which were all people being marked as different by different kinds of categories, either as Muslims or as Turks or as foreigners, or you name it, and obviously or as Jews, and we invited them to kind of cheer or toast to their dominance. And that was kind of trying to establish a space that wasn't really taking place outside of the theater. While at the same time, Gorki Theatre is the place where this kind of counter-narrative has become possible. I think I wouldn't have been able to frame something like this without Gorki Theatre and the amazing work they've been doing. So really, this is a collaborative work, which I sometimes come to call the Jewish migrant contact zone that has emerged, especially in Berlin, but not only there, in the last 20 to 30 years. And you can really see how this has opened up a new perspective also on what being Jewish means. And that also has to do with a Soviet migration, which built as kind of in the makeup of the Jewish community in Germany. You find about 90% of the Jews being from the Soviet Union, which makes it a very migrant community. But they're not being addressed as migrants, they're being addressed as the old Jews, because this is what Germans need, right? The theater of memory needs the old Jews reenacting a normalcy that has passed for good, forever. So now you have this utterly different Jewish community, which is being demanded to perform and respond to specific desires, which they can't possibly respond to. So if they do, they are being, what they have to trade in is recognition by mainstream society for representation of their radical diversity, which they can't represent on the floor, on the blackboard of the theater of memory. So in a way, the theater we are playing is trying to establish discourse positions, establish frameworks which allow for the representation of different marginalized groups to be able to come to talk in a way they would like to define for themselves. Because one of the central notions of this whole idea of society being made up by a dominant culture and minority cultures that have to respond to that, or minority positions have to respond to that, it's not only about cultures, is that you're being put into a very specific position. Just as Hans just said about the identitarians, and then you need a counterpart. And then suddenly the identitarians start to define your position because you're being framed as a counterpart, which I don't really see why I have to be always in relation to a right-wing German perspective that feels like all Jews should go. And this is what and I think that is a discussion that has been going on, whether we should talk to the right wing or whether we should try to establish a different framework that would allow for something like the Jewish Muslim hegemony. So that is the intervention we're planning, and I guess it's always about the specific context we're talking about that make it more accessible, I guess, in the specific speeches. If we go into that, I could tell you right where people respond to stuff that has been happening in Germany the months before, which they kind of try to pick up on.
Thank you very much. So I know we have a lot in the chat, so I might give it back to Moritz for, yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. I think it was great to open up the discussion. and also giving you some points that we can kind of continue to discuss. We have some questions in the chat coming on also about how representation works and how the people represented, how they're aware of the roles. I think following up on Christina, what struck me is that all the films in different contexts, in different ways, were kind of using some form of distancing. I mean, the distancing was the word Robert was using in relation to storytelling, in relation to representation, which I think is interesting. I mean, that's been this old, I wouldn't say old, I mean, it's still around, but this tradition of presenting the other as an authentic voice that should tell us something about whatever, you know, how it is to be this other out there in the ghetto and whatever. And this tradition has been really heavily criticized, I think, of good reasons, that you're kind of having the idea of authenticity, putting down to somebody who kind of tell us, the others, how it is to be. This kind of ape I'm normally saying, you know, let us hear how the ape is feeling today, so to speak. And if you want to break down the notion of authenticity on it, then you need some kind of formal element of distancing. You need to make some intervention in a sense that you kind of show that there's a distance, there's a formal dimension in it. And I think all the different films in different ways, and you know, if you don't agree, I'm kind of asking you, just go in, you know, but what I'm trying to say is that all the different films, that I think are quite different, are similar in the sense that they're all trying not just to present the authentic voice, but doing something. And maybe in the sense of, you know, Max, the film that you're making, Max, very much about also giving a collective or collaborative, maybe not collective, but you know, a voice of people coming together, not just one voice, not just here's the voice of the other. So I think the distancing is really interesting here. And maybe you could just expand one or two words on that, or whether you feel I'm completely on the wrong way when I'm saying this. I mean, the three of you, I don't know who wants to take over a little bit. Maybe also Christina. I don't want to exclude you, Christina. I'm just trying to get the ball back to the three. I don't know. Or maybe it's just too stupid one saying that nobody has any comment.
No, I like it. I don't want to take it away from anyone. Robert, you were just unmuting yourself, please.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think, I mean, obviously it's an important part of the structure of my film, at least, is to, you know, to not be putting the subjects on the spotlight, not to have them take the stage visually in the film itself. And so I think it's certainly a large part of how I've so far at least structured that film. And I think it's certainly, again, as I mentioned in my sort of overview, it's something I'm very conscious of in my own work. And I think maybe that's just part of how I've been trained here in the US, but it seems like a very, you know, it's important to be conscious of that in the work that we make. And so it's definitely central to how I've seen this project come together.
Yeah, I can maybe also say a few words on that. First of all, I would like to ask Moritz where you see that in my film, where you see this distancing, because I'm not sure about it myself. What I know is I was aware of this, and I was also thinking about how this could maybe be avoided. And one of the things I did was I always started out the interviews with asking people how they would like to be represented, and if they had a problem with being represented by me and by the film, and also I also asked several of the people in the film how I could avoid marking them or marking them out, and also how the film could somehow formally be post-migrant. And most of them didn't have any concerns about being represented. So the answers I received when I asked them was they were all similar and they were all not so interesting. So I decided not to have them in the film. But in the beginning, I asked everyone this question, and the thought was to have them say it in the film. And in fact, in the rough cut, I still had, what's her name, Moritz, this other
What do you mean, Anna Melzer? No.
The scientist who was in the end not in the film.
Oh, Riem Spielhaus. Yeah.
Riem Spielhaus, yes. She opened the film talking about how I could avoid making a film that would somehow end up marking out. But since she was somehow doubling what the other German scientists were saying, we decided to not have her in the film in the end. So she was edited out. But my question back to you, Moritz, where you see the distancing.
Well, I mean, first of all, I like the distancing. I mean, you kind of said you want to avoid it, which is interesting as well. I think what's happening, and I'm also kind of referring to a comment from the chat. I mean, everybody can read the chat as well. From I don't have my glasses, Erin. I mean, telling the story of being in a refugee center, a Bosnian refugee center, and being the object subject of all the journalists coming and making stories and then telling here. I mean, you can read it in the chat. I don't read it up here, but people were aware and making up the stories for the journalists and for the filmmakers and whoever come to the refugee camp. And I think the distancing I'm talking about is actually being aware of that people are playing roles. So instead of presenting them as if they're not playing roles, you somehow accept as a media as well, I mean, media and the film media, that we're dealing with role playing and maybe kind of try to invent some kind of role playing out of it. And I think the people in your film, I mean, giving the question back to me, I think you're kind of giving them the space to play the roles they want to play, but also kind of breaking it all the time up. I mean, you're having all the scientists like this, all this boring comments from Sabrina and me and like Aforotan and whoever, and I think it's a kind of breaking up the kind of story of here is a real voice coming, telling us something. It's more like an acting in the film itself, and the film itself is giving a frame of action and acting. And I think it's even in Mack's film, it's very much in the center that everybody's acting in the scene. And I think I personally like it really a lot. I think it's great to have this kind of performating elements instead of believing that you can have the authentic voice, which is always kind of not working and maybe also not what we really need. So I see it in your film as well, but maybe also in a style that you're breaking it up by including different, scientists and other actors who kind of stopping up and kind of commenting and whatever, trying to be clever. I don't know. Max, what are you saying?
I would like to add something to that, because I feel there's something there's a dialectical tension within the term authentic, right? Because in a way, Postmigrant theater claims that it wants to tell stories that haven't been told. It claims that the German theater landscape hasn't been able to represent a lot of the migrant perspectives and stories people brought along. And that is, in a way, a claim to authenticity. But at the same time, I feel that there's an increasing repressive element in this notion of the authentic, which really starts with the idea that authenticity is being distributed unevenly to minorities or to specific people, whether the stories they'll tell kind of meet the expectations of the audience. So the authentic Jew is going to tell you specific stories, and then you feel he's been telling you an authentic story. It's going to be a Shoah story. It's going to be a story on anti-Semitism. It's going to entail something with Israel, and it's going to be sad. This is going to be an authentic Jewish story. You're going to see it. You're going to feel, wow, this is authentic, especially if it makes you cry. The problem with that idea of authenticity is that it kind of just pushes the buttons that are being connected to that position. It's not by any kind of analytical means authentic in referring to a meaningful, complete, complex subject, but rather it's very limited to the expectation of what each and everyone wants to see. So I feel like there has been a very problematic quality to this demand for authenticity, and I find myself calling for more lies, more fiction, and less authenticity on stage and with our place and the work we're doing, because I feel that this authenticity restricts and kind of limits the art we're doing. I'd rather have everybody lying about their own story than being authentic.
Well, there would be a lot of things to say on this specific point. I'm always referring myself to one of the program posters from Gorki Theatre talking about backgrounds, not poster like the flyer, talking about backgrounds and saying everybody has a background and it's up to you when and especially how to tell your background and if you want to and which way you want to do it. But it's a long discussion. I think it's time also to open it a little bit up here. There could be some other people who would like to join the discussion. I don't know exactly how Markus, Erin, I guess if somebody has something to mention, how do we?
Yeah, please, I would encourage everyone at this point, enable gallery view, enable your videos. Let's get here in a dialogue and raise your voices. You don't necessarily have to use the chat. You can see what's going on there as well. In reactions, you have a raise hand button, and then Moritz can give you the word. So please just go ahead if you have any questions on the filmmakers. I have a question myself too, but I want to give the space first to all the other voices.
If you're having trouble finding the reaction button, I think a physical hand will do as well. We'll see that if your video's on. Does anybody want to offer a question or a comment on what's happened so far?
I have a question. Well, two questions for Max. One, I was reminded of Augusto Boal's ideas, theatre of the oppressed. The idea of the work being an intervention, and I wondered whether that influences your approach. And the other question, I find it really interesting, this idea of a Muslim-Jewish hegemony. So did you have Muslims and Jewish people together in one space? So I didn't quite understand how it worked.
Thank you for the question. Would you repeat the first part? I'm afraid I missed the first half of it.
The first part really just, it occurred to me, or I kind of recognized the ideas that Augusto Boal had. I don't know if you know him, he's a Latin American. So this idea of the intervention rather than a product.
I see. Thank you. Well, I did, during my studies, I studied political sciences, and I did have a course on Augusto Boal once, organized by fellow students, which I really liked. As far as what I took away from Boal was more this kind of idea of working in the public and of being able to intervene in the public and all that. I think there's more also like a tradition within German art or acting coming from Schlingensief and coming from those stages where art is being understood as an engaged work with the public without necessarily taking place outside. And I'd say that movies, for example, or the whole digital opens up a hybrid space that is neither taking place in theater nor taking place outside theater, but really in both places or none of them. So that is really interesting for me, because in a way, producing a movie and having everyone decide when they want to see it, or like a short movie, really is yet a different mode than anything Boal or Schlingensief would have done before. I mean, Schlingensief kind of engaged with TV, so he was but it was still linear TV. We didn't have Mediathek back then. So I think things have changed considerably, talking about movies and internet and how this is accessible now and distributable through multiple channels, and being able to go viral and being able to really reach everyone, even though they're not living in Berlin right now. So it's a different kind of localness, if you want. So talking about Jewish Muslim, yes, for sure. We had Jews and Muslims there. As people were eager to point out, we only had very bad Jews and very bad Muslims there. We didn't have any Orthodox Jews. We didn't have any religious Muslims there. People were a bit angry about it because they expected us to invite the hardcore Jews and hardcore Muslims. It's all ironic what I'm saying. So what I'm trying to say is that we didn't care about religion, but we did care about ascribed identity. So there's a lot of non-religious Jews who are still being Jews, and there's a lot of people who are being made Muslims who 20, 30 years ago would have been called differently. That's an interesting thing, because in Germany, the last 3 decades, you can really see how the labeling of the foreigner has changed. Before, when I was little in the 90s, when I grew up, those people were called Arabs, Turks, and foreigners, or asylum seekers or something. Now, things have changed completely. You almost never hear stories about Turks and Arabs, except for Arab clans. But what you hear is a lot about Muslims. And suddenly a lot of people who would have not considered themselves being religious at all find themselves in the category of being a Muslim. So talking about Jewish Muslim hegemony really is a way to pick up on this reality and to say maybe art has the potential to combine two things which in the public are being moved as far away from each other as possible. The Jews are being threatened by the Muslims, which is why mainstream German society has protected the Jews. And that already is a self-construction of the German society, because obviously Jews are being not threatened by Muslims more than they're being threatened by traditional German Nazis. In fact, traditional German Nazis still amount to 90% of the violence being acted out against Jews. So again, there's a lot of context to unwrap, but yes, the Jewish Muslim hegemony was an intervention which obviously did not exclude queer perspectives, and it did not exclude feminist perspectives, but it was rather a flashy, polemic counter hypothesis against the idea of the notion of German leading Leitkultur hegemony.
I think that's a really interesting point that you mentioned, and seeing it also in the United States, sort of the rise of religion as a really important signifier again, rather than foreigners being described based on where they're from. The importance of religion suddenly as a signifier is something we're seeing a lot here as well. And it's kind of terrifying, obviously, because I think that's what leads to the kind of what happened with the Nazis. I think that kind of vitriol is more easily directed at religious differences than at diversity from place.
I mean, it's not like in the 90s people were being treated more nicely because they were being called Turks or Arabs. I mean, there was a lot of violence going on, but it's what I find funny about this is that at least in Germany, Christianity does not is losing control and losing influence all around. And suddenly, by talking about Muslim, people are also talking about Christianity again. So it almost feels like it's a big setup to re-strengthen Christianity while it's actually losing influence. I find this a bit weird. Like suddenly it's Jewish Christian culture. How? But I guess in the States it's different because their Christianity is very, very much alive.
I mean, it is on the decline as it is everywhere, but I think I don't see that kind of perspective that you're describing. I think it still has a strong hold on the right, for sure.
For sure.
If I just could come in here, I think what's interesting from the 3 films as well is that I personally see them all as interventions. Like I think Max was using the word intervention a couple of times, but I see them all as interventions, but I think it's different contexts. I mean, now you were discussing Germany and the United States. And I mean, living in Denmark for many years, first generation immigrant, as some call it, I think the Danish context is completely different than the German context, for example, much more hard, even, by the way. And I think the film Hans Christian was making is an intervention in a specific context. And it's always interesting to include the discussion, how it's a situation where your audience is, so to speak. And yeah, I don't know exactly where I want to go with it, but mainly the point that's interventional part of these films, all of them, maybe also uses different languages, different forms, because they're talking to different different settings, in different situations, in different times, so to speak. So I don't know exactly where it leads, but maybe somebody else can follow up with a good question.
I see Lois has her hand up. Go ahead, Lois.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. This is really intriguing to be set or given a window to cultural production in Europe in particular. I want to go back right to the beginning and to Christina's first point about refugee tales, or the work that Robert Knight is covering in the video, which I haven't seen, unfortunately. And I haven't read the most recent Refugee Tales book, but I have thought about it a lot over the years. And I think it was definitely staged as an intervention, a theatrical intervention on many levels with different methodologies. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of the language, the English language, and it was kind of, as I understand it, his reclaiming of the language being built of migration, out of migration and out of conversation, you know, going back to Chaucer's tales, and particularly his David Hurd's afterword, where he talks about reclaiming the language, that aspect of the language. And then, so the intervention was to have, you know, these highly celebrated writers and actors, Jeremy Iron performed part of it in a set of videos. And then they had these evening events, none of which I've experienced other than the website. But the issues of appropriation are really, really tricky. And I've often wondered how that works. Like, I loved the idea that in a culture that has so invisibilized, disappeared people within the detention system and the post-migration immigration system, people are disappeared within the midst of the hegemonic culture. So does it work as an intervention to capture or to retell, or materialize, maybe is a better word, those stories, those conditions through the voices of those in power, the writers, the celebrities, the like phenomenal actors that took on speaking those stories. So can the language be called on to do its work? Anyway, that's what I really thought was interesting. I think Max, your project, and also Hans does a very similar thing. So you're appropriating hegemony, but then at a point, you know, are the original voices lost or prevented from ever speaking?
So I think it's a great question. I think, you know, are we silencing in some ways the original authors of these stories by anonymizing them, essentially, right? We're in the books, they are anonymous. The names are gone. They're being given generic titles and descriptions. So their stories are being told, but without having any ownership or real connection back to it. And I think, you know, one of the things that I guess, luckily my film is in a rough draft form, and there's going to be changes as it goes forward. But I think, you know, one of the things that I try to do in the clip that I showed was, you know, pair one of the former detainees with the language, with the reading. And so it's not that person, right? It's not that person's story, but it's still a visual of a person actually, you know, living, existing in the UK, and a reflection of their experiences. And so I think the film actually has a potential to kind of recenter that language, hopefully, and recenter those stories to allow for, you know, a different kind of connection to the people who are having those experiences.
I think, just to clarify, it's really important to realize that at the start of that project, or at least how I understand it, those stories were, would have put people in extreme danger if they had been assigned to them or their names had been revealed. There were people who were in detention who had revealed those stories. That part is clear in the first book. I don't know if that's
clear. And I mentioned that in the chat too, is that there is a legitimate fear of being put back in detention, and I think that was a concern among many of these individuals. Was yes, maybe they have come out of detention and they are being given leave to remain in the UK potentially indefinitely, but that can always be taken away. And that was, they may have been there for 20 years before they got detained the first time. And so there's always going to be this fear of potentially going back in detention. Whatever the UK has said or continues to say is not going to change that. And so I think many of those people remain, with legitimate fears. And so there's a legitimate reason for anonymizing those stories potentially.
I noticed Lucy.
Sorry.
I think Lucy had her hand up there.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself in the chat as I should have done. I'm from the UK. I have some connection with Refugee Tales, and thank you, Erin, for inviting me to this really interesting discussion this evening. We're part of another group together. I think Refugee Tales doesn't need to be sort of interpreted by anybody, especially not by me. And I think what you've done with it, Robert, is really interesting. I suppose where I'm coming at with the with the kind of representation of the stories and the kind of revoicing of the voices of detainees through Refugee Tales is, I think, in a way, one of the roles of having professional writers is not that they represent the writer, but they almost interpret the story. They kind of put that spin, a really interesting conversation. I think it was Max earlier on saying that you have a Jewish story that's expected to tick a certain box. That I think one of the ways of one of the values of using a professional writer is that the professional writer is allowed to say the things that the migrant or the detainee isn't allowed to say. So in that way, they're able to voice something really important. I would say I think the Refugee Tales organisers have really struggled with this representation issue and have, as discussed a lot, which is why, as you said, in the most recent book, the migrants themselves are writing on their own behalf, but that's kind of something new. But I suppose, as well as wanting just to throw that in, I'm really interested by this notion of truth in a story and obfuscation of a story, and how by telling a kind of non-story or a different version of the story, you can actually say more about the truth of the situation. That we all know that obviously the truth isn't in the direct words one says, but it's in that positionality, and it's in the way a story is told and how it's told and when it's told and so on. But I'll shut up now, it's enough of me.
Well, I think, Erin, you stopped me once again if there's another hand coming up. I think the question of truth is very interesting and difficult, I guess. I mean, it's really like, what is truth? And if you tell the same story 3 times, I guess you have 3 different truth stories. And I would like to maybe follow a little bit up on the discussion to Robert. Once again, a question. When I've seen your film, I had the impression on an artistic level, but maybe it was not even consciously done, but the voices, the personal voices are changing. I mean, in the beginning, it's a third-person narrator, then it's a second-person narrator, in the end, it's a first-person narrator. It's not the migrant itself, I mean, not the detainee itself speaking, of course, it's another voiceover speaking, a female voice talking in the first-person narrator's voice for the detainee. But in the beginning, it's somebody else talking about he is doing anything. Then it's coming from like you are doing, and in the end, it's like the I, it's a first-person narrator coming. And I felt it was a kind of consciousness way of, coming closer to some kind of idea of now we're coming to the person, and we're still not getting it because it's a female voice talking on the male perspective. On the but maybe I don't know whether you have some comment on, is there some idea behind this kind of change in persons there?
I mean, I think it's a reflection again of the structure of the Refugee Tales books. So they are being told from different perspectives, and that, you know, all of that dialogue is from the writing itself. So there's nothing there that I have written myself. It's all taken from the books directly. So actually, the introduction there is Jeremy Irons in the very beginning of the film. That is, you know, he's reading the introduction to one of the books, and that's his voiceover. And so it does change, I think, depending on the author, kind of what perspective, what point of view, what third person, first person perspective they're taking. But to me, that is part of the, you know, I don't want to like have the person that you're seeing on the screen be identified directly with the story that we're hearing. So again, the story that we're hearing in the clip that I shared was the mother. And so that's from a mother's perspective. And of course, we're looking at a man listening to him while he's playing piano. And so I think it would be disingenuous if it started to match up, and we might be thinking, oh, is that the person that the story is about? I think in fact, we don't want to have that kind of feeling, because that would just perpetuate the inaccuracy of, you know, these stories, which are already being retold by other people. So I think it is important that there is, you know, that we don't have that direct connection between the visual and the subjects of the stories. But it's great to hear that you picked up on it. And I think it's great that hopefully that will become a more intentional thing also as it's finalized. Thank you.
Yeah, Robert, I think it's another great example for distancing, what all of you have in common too. And maybe distancing, or this kind of alienation effect, is also what then helps to also undo the framing of the dominant discourses. And that's a question for me, actually, for all of you, everyone here, and picking up on what Lucy said in terms of representation and interpretation. There's always a framing at place, and the moment the framing is given in the hands of the participant, is that more likely than actually to, besides alienation effects that you all have used as filmmakers, but but if the agency is giving back, also in terms of making the film to the participants, if it's as far as possible, of course, with Refugee Tales, it's a different story also in terms of protecting them. But this gesture of protection is also, again, reiterating the dominant discourse, right? What Christina also said, now, who are the timekeepers? Who are the ones who are remaking, unmaking home? No? Who are the ones who are humanizing and dehumanizing? So who's behind the who's behind the framing, and how far can we avoid to reiterate certain types of framing?
Markus, thank you. I think by saying alienation, that made me like, I feel like on the one hand it's alienation and not being authentic, and on the other hand it's allyship and being allied, and I think, and that probably goes without saying, and I'm sorry if that is clear anyway, but I think trust is a very central element in that kind of work. And I don't know if you saw in my clip, you see myself sitting on the table. It's me being part of that. It's like, it's not a movie I make about people, it's a movie we make. And that is very different. I mean, it's me curating the festival because someone has to take care of the organization, all that. But I asked those people to write their toasts, and without like the quality of their toasts determined the quality of the movie. There was no way we could make anything like this happen if they wouldn't have brought their creativity and their ideas and their provocations and their suffering and their anger and all that to the table, literally. So I feel like that really is, I don't really have this, like this work, at least this work doesn't really have this problem of representing someone else, because really we're all being shown. Everybody who's visible is participating in the movie, and there's almost none who's not visible, who's still a part of the movie, except maybe the 1-2 people behind the camera.
I think that's another great point, is just this idea of shared authorship, the idea that, you know, as directors, none of us are really the authors behind these films. We are just trying to put the pieces together to make something cohesive, and hopefully tells a story that's larger than the individual stories that are being told. But there is this idea of shared authorship that I think is central to all 3 of the films.
Well, you could still, I mean, continue this discussion going away from the authorship in artistic films, which we all somehow are doing, to like scientific community. I'm always kind of going to my dean and saying at university, we are making research on post-migration. That's not one person of color employed in the whole institute, the department I'm working on. So also as researchers, we are framing, of course, I mean, all the time. And I think we have to discuss, which is quite obvious what I'm saying. I mean, we all know this, but I think just to follow up on the artistic dimension, it's also a dimension of asking our own institutions about what kind of power structures we are dealing with. And I really think we have to change. I mean, what I'm trying to say, shared authorship can work in some specific projects, but when you're a scientist, then you need colleagues to work together. And if you don't have colleagues of color, then you have a problem. And if you don't have anybody giving you money to employ people, then you're having even a further problem. So it's also about structure and money and resources and everything. And I guess you're all aware of it, but I just want to add it to the discussion that Robert and Max were starting.
I mean, I think Moritz, in reply to your dilemma, I would say that to allocate in every budget to make sure that there is money that is allocated to the capacity building of those you're working with, those people who you are, you know, it's to do with the quality of the engagement you're going to have with those people, because there is I'm not saying this is a black and white, it's not a racial issue. When I work in Sudan in making films, you know, my perspective as somebody who grew up in diaspora is very different to somebody who is local, and it's very difficult. Only in retrospect do I see how I have framed certain inquiries from my vantage point, and that by doing so I have quashed a more local point of view or perspective on something. But I think there is the fact that as more and more people in academia are interested in making films, they are able to leverage funds, huge fund, that even independent filmmakers can't, because if you have an institutional affiliation, you are able to leverage the kind of money that artists aren't able to leverage, and that local people who are the subjects of your films aren't able to leverage. So it's really, I think it's really important to look at how you frame and how your presuppositions determine the kind of questions you ask, and I think to actually be open about that, to be reflexive about that is really important, and to give back to the community that you're working with.
That really speaks to me of what Max was talking about, the allyship of the partnered creation, you know, production, and that sort of the trust that's required for that. In order to build that trust, I think reflexivity is absolutely essential, you know, to become aware of how we positioned ourselves, how we, you know, for all the best intentions as academics coming into a community context to do participant-centered work. I mean, it's just, there's this, every project is going to end up failing in some way or another. And so to be able to work with that productively and, you know, turn to use like a gardening metaphor, to turn that over into richer soil for the next project. And that's really becomes the source of trust, I think, in those relational projects. Yeah, I mean, I know we're right at 11 o'clock, so Moritz, you might want to cut me off. Feel free to do that. I cut you off once before. But I was just going to say that the one thing that I was really interested in, it was the intermediality of each of your projects. So Robert, you were working with poetry and you were putting it into a film. And we were dealing with these sort of performative, I'm not even sure what to call it, Max, but these performances of academic prowess, or but these you said that there's a specific tradition that you're working with that I'm unaware of, and that was not your original intent, but that got put into film, right? And Hans, you were working with theater and then putting it into film, and I wonder what we lose when we turn these embodied experiences into film, and I wonder why we do it. So maybe that's one of my questions, is why do we turn this into film? What do we gain from that? But I know we're at 11, so I don't know if that's the question just to leave us on, or Mack, Moritz, maybe you can make the call on that.
I think let's take this as the last question, isn't it? I think it's a great question. So shouldn't we answer that one? I mean, but having some comment from?
I have a simple answer, which is hopefully larger audiences. I think, ultimately all of us are trying to reach new audiences. And I think, in the case of Refugee Tales, their books reach a certain audience, and their walks certainly reach a certain audience, as people have discussed, going into community halls and reading these stories. And hopefully film is a new audience, and all of us are trying to share the work and reach larger groups of people and help effectuate change.
Yes, what Robert says, and just to add to that, I think every artistic form, or even science as well, and research and all, they all have specific modes and things they can say and things they can't. There's specific temporal, spatial requirements. Poetry is not theater, theater is not movies, movies is not a non-fiction essay. And I feel like now I'm preparing an exhibition for a Jewish museum in Germany on the history of Jewish revenge. And it's really inspiring and interesting to just figure out how museums work, because they're very different from all those spaces I've just mentioned. So it's more about kind of widening the claviature, I don't know, the keys you can play in order to be able to say the things you want to say, and then obviously, as Robert just said, reach a wider audience and be more effective in a way and always find the right forms for the things you're aiming for.
Yes, and I would maybe like to add to that it's also putting these works in a larger context, in this case, in a Danish context, and of course also making them aware of each other in a way, and making them enter into a dialogue with each other. And I think when we started talking about the film, Moritz and I, we were really discussing, will it make sense to make a film about Denmark and Danish theater, because there is nothing going on here. And once we started researching a little bit, we found out that there are things going on, and the film is also testifying to that and bringing these works into dialogue with each other. And now it's only been 2 years since then, and now we have 2 theater directors, theater bosses who actually run theaters, who are working for this idea of a post-migrant theater. So yeah, creating these groups of allies is also what a film can do by putting these works together, putting these people into a larger dialogue, I think.
Right, I think this is a great finishing line about talking about alliances and collaboration and those kind of things. I always like to stop there. I don't know, Markus, Erin, who is the last word here? Isn't it you made the whole thing? Isn't it you should say something, shouldn't you, one of you? So from my side, I would like to thank everybody very much. I think it was inspiring, and especially the 3 of you presenting your works. But I think, Markus, you have the last word, and I'm already saying goodbye.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Moritz, for moderating. Thank you, Christina, also for your comment, and all 3 of you, Max and Hans Christian and Robert, for really great discussion. And thanks to everyone actually here in the Zoom room, and for our roundtable having joined us, and also the discussion. And you know, I spontaneously would say right now, I know some people have to go, most people will probably have other plans, but if you have time, hang out and chat with each other. If you still have feel the desire to, we can leave it open for a little bit. That's totally fine. If everyone feels like talking about collaboration, talking about how to break down the institutional colonial context, decentering, which is also our case here. And that brings me back to the beginning of our session today. And I'd really like to thank Mack again and the Musqueam people for their hospitality and their openness to make this possible. Without them, we wouldn't be here, if I may say so. And so, yeah, this is basically my closing words. Erin, if you want to just give, you know, the heads up for what's coming, and then I'd say let's keep the room open.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks so much for being here. We do have so 3 more sessions. They're all going to be, I think, quite different. So tomorrow, Regina Romhild, actually, I may be pronouncing that wrong. Markus, you can correct me on that, is going to be giving a talk. And then on Friday, we have 2 workshops that are pairing Indigenous and settler filmmakers for conversations around that. So slightly shorter sessions on Friday. So you're really welcome to come back. We'd love to have you come back and join those conversations. And otherwise, thanks for being here. Have a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever it is that you are in the world.